Wow, so RFK on a Twitter space with Elon Musk, still going as I record this. I recommend everybody go back and listen to it. From what I've heard, it sounds much better than the Ron DeSantis space. I listened to the Ron DeSantis space in full, including all of the technical missteps and all that. And I'm not going to give DeSantis personally crap for the technical issues, so I separate that from my analysis. DeSantis himself was boring. It was not fun to listen to DeSantis. I was not engaged, even though he was saying things generally that I agreed with. I thought he made good points. He's a boring speaker a lot of the time. He's one of those that he does better when he has someone to bounce off against. The good clips you have of DeSantis are when he's arguing with a reporter who asked him a nasty question. With RFK Jr., though, I found him much more pleasurable to listen to, even though people roundly, the one criticism I've seen of RFK Jr. in this Twitter space, not anything he said, not any of his positions that he took, not saying, hey, he lied here and he's got his facts wrong. No, what they've said is, I don't like the sound of his voice. He sounds like he's dying. Which, he has I think it's a neurological issue. His vocal cords are partially paralyzed or something like that. So he sounds hoarse all the time. He sounds like he's got, like strep throat or something. Even though he doesn't. That's just what his voice sounds like. And, yes, it's a valid criticism to say if you have to listen to somebody speak and you don't like the sound of their voice. It's a variation of what I just said about DeSantis. But the difference here is that it's not that DeSantis' voice was unpleasant. It's that I did not engage with the content. He said things I agreed with, but he didn't say it in a way in which I felt engaged. RFK, even if I don't find the sound of his voice to be that much of an issue, but I felt engaged by what he was saying. It felt much more like a real conversation. It felt much more natural, even though it's a lot of the same people. You've got Elon Musk and David Sachs on here, just like you did with DeSantis. And it felt natural. It flowed well out of everybody. And they're just talking back and forth. They're having a conversation about the issues. I feel like what went on today with RFK Jr. is what the DeSantis campaign wanted to happen, but it just didn't for them. And I think that this is a good format for discussing politics with high-level leaders like this, with presidential candidates, because you get long-form, candid conversations with them where they can get in-depth on specific issues, largely foreign policy. In the case of RFK Jr., I've been listening on and off. I haven't heard everything that he said today, but what I have heard has all been very good. I think that he's smart to focus on unifying issues. He's not going for wedge issues. He's going for things that he can build broad consensus for on, across members of both parties. They're just general common sense things. And usually when a politician says, oh, this is just common sense issue that everybody can agree on, they're gaslighting you. They do that with things like, gun control. Well, it's just common sense gun control. We just want to take away your concealed carry handguns and make you defend yourself with rocks and sticks. It's just common sense gun control. We don't want weapons of war out there. That M&P shield in your back pocket, that's a weapon of war. We can't have people carrying those around. That's not the case here. RFK is bringing up issues, from what I've heard, that an ordinary person who is not, just politically tribal and is told, oh, I love the CIA because, no, if you have someone who is an unbiased person who doesn't have much of an opinion and you explain these things to them, they're only going to come down on kind of one side of the issue. You don't have a lot of people who go, I think that the intelligence agencies should have a total dominion over my life, over what I think and what I believe. You're not going to have a lot of people who say, you know what, I think it's a good idea that we're funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. You know what, I think that it's probably better that we err on the side of not starting a war with another nuclear power rather than erring on the side of just being as aggressive as possible and hoping that the other nuclear power, doesn't fight back. These are issues that I think he would have been, he would have found agreement amongst 95% of Democrats just a few years ago. And, sure, he would have gotten more pushback from Republicans, but broadly speaking, this would have been very popular. Now it's a little more split. Now you have a lot more Republicans who are open to the idea of peace, and a lot more Democrats who are indoctrinated by war propaganda because, MSNBC and CNN, they've pivoted more in that direction. During the Bush years, because, anti-war sentiment was so wrapped up with being anti-Bush, CNN and MSNBC had to at least tolerate anti-war sentiment, even if they didn't agree with it personally, with the exception, of course, of Phil Donahue being fired by MSNBC over his anti-war stances, but that was at the beginning. You see, at the beginning, everyone had to be pro-war and pro-Iraq war. As soon as we were into 2004, though, it was cool to be anti-Iraq war, and Phil Donahue would have been fine probably by that point. These days, though, you have your pro-war Republicans, you have your pro-war Democrats, but you also have, on both sides, you have voters who oppose those ideas. And every issue that I've seen RFK emphasize in his campaign so far has been issues that have supporters on both the left and right, which is a difficult strategy for a primary campaign because he's essentially locked out of a lot of his would-be supporters. He has a very universal message. And so he can't really take advantage of in a Democratic primary of the independents and Republicans that he would, that he appeals to. Except in a place like New Hampshire, which I believe has an open primary, there he will benefit from that, and I think that his campaign is almost geared perfectly to compete in New Hampshire. It's a smaller state. There's less places for him to travel. He can, show up locally. He's basically a hometown boy, being from, like Kennedy from Massachusetts anyway. And both Republicans and independents can choose to cross the aisle, figuratively speaking, and vote for him in the Democratic primary if it's an open primary state, which I should have double-checked that, but I'm 99% certain that it is. Because there are a lot of independents and independent-minded people in New Hampshire who, I think they like having that freedom of being able to vote whoever they want in the primary. Now, viewership or listenership was comparable, from what I saw, to when DeSantis was on. Now, when the initial DeSantis run-up was very high, I forget where it got up to, but it was over 100,000. And then by the time that DeSantis was actually, when they ironed things out and they got things working, it was like 43,000. And then RFK's number was sitting around 60,000, like an hour and a half into the whole situation. And so that, to me, it seems like pretty decent retention. And considering he's, I think, a much less hyped candidate than DeSantis, is getting a lot less media coverage, I think that's quite admirable. And we're early enough in the campaign to where, you can use all the exposure you get. There's a lot of people, I think, who probably are listening to that space and familiarizing themselves with RFK Jr. for the first time. Because a lot of people just don't know who he is and don't know what he thinks. If they know anything about him, they know what people like Mehdi Hasan say, which is that he's an anti-vax, Bannon-endorsed, and Tucker-platformed, scary right-wing Democrat. Now, do I think that RFK Jr. is a right-wing Democrat? No. In fact, just a few years ago, I would have thought of RFK as being, on the left wing of the Democrat Party. That's, those of us who grew up on the right, RFK Jr. was one of these crazy boogeymen. Oh my gosh, he's an environmentalist lawyer. It's like, imagine the Venn diagram of, you've got environmentalists and you've got lawyers, two natural enemies of every conservative. And he's both. But he's a much deeper man than that. He's very well thought out. He's very willing to engage, and I think that that's when he's at his best, is when people are pressing him, when he's being asked tough questions, because he doesn't flinch. He's very good under that kind of pressure, which I think this is like a good or example of like age and wisdom. Unlike with let's say Biden, who's old to the point of being senile. RFK is old to the point of he's heard he's seen this movie before. He's still got a lot of energy. He's only in his 60s. He's not in his 80s. And so he's been around the block. He's seen almost everything. He's been very politically engaged since he's a very young age. And so there's not a lot that can faze him at this point. His ideas have been tested intellectually for decades and decades and decades. And he's set in his beliefs in that sense. But he's confident enough in his own judgment to where he's willing to consider I think he does a good job of this when he's presented with an alternate point. He considers it because he's comfortable enough in his own beliefs to not feel insecure or intimidated by dissent. And so these are reasons why I think he presents well. This is separate than just the sound of his voice. This comes down to things more like, intonation, attitude, energy. Perhaps on camera he comes across better because you can see that he's clearly in good shape and sits up straight, and he's a very tall man. When it's just audio, you hear the gruff voice of an old man, which is hoarse, and the image that you conjure up in your head, if you've never seen him before, could be this shriveled up, hunched over grandpa who's in worse shape even than Biden. But anyway, I don't think that there's been a bad appearance by RFK Jr. yet. Every interview and podcast I've seen with him, there's not been any examples where they're like, oh, they really got him that time. They tripped him up, and and they got a sound bite that made him look bad. That hasn't been the case. There's been two prominent examples of the media trying to get RFK Jr., and it was one, ABC, asking him about vaccines, and apparently his answer was so solid that they just had to edit the whole portion about vaccines out of the interview. ABC brought it up and said, hey, we asked him about vaccines, but his answers were just so horrible we can't show them to you. Well, if his answers were that bad, they would be showing you his answers to make him look stupid, to expose him. But they didn't, which means he had really good, smart answers that would have been well received by the audience. And so the producer was like, cut that out. Then Crystal Ball of Breaking Points tried to do the same thing to him. And, and when she got walloped by RFK Jr. on the vaccine issue, in a very friendly way possible, by the way. I mean, he came across as just a nice, happy, totally unintimidated by her, totally unthreatened. It didn't seem like he was ganging up on this, frail young woman, even though Crystal's not very young, but she's young compared to him, and beating her down with facts and knowledge. It was not that way at all. No, she basically said, hey, you're wrong about everything when it comes to vaccines, and when are you going to admit that you're wrong? And he just kind of sat there, and he went, well, I'm not really campaigning on vaccines, but, since you brought it up, where am I wrong? And he sat there, and he just looked very curious. He was like, oh, please, educate me. If he looked like he was eager to learn something new, like he was expecting the crystal ball would know something, and actually, have something to add to the conversation. And then she was just all kind of flustered and said, I don't want to get bogged down in it. We're out of time. And then they shut down the segment. And her own comment section savaged her over it. Okay, so when you're trying to pull a gotcha on a candidate and your own viewers turn against you, I think it's safe to say you didn't get him. And so this guy he's unflappable. It would be interesting to see him on a stage with Trump to see if Trump could get to him, because Trump is able to trip up everybody. But I think if it were, oh my gosh, if it were RFK versus DeSantis, oh, say you need to say some prayers for Ron DeSantis, because I don't think he'd hold up against this guy. He's better than him at this. Ron DeSantis has his strengths, but I don't think that public speaking and engagement, and communication, that's not it. He has other strengths. This isn't one of them. RFK Jr. is a great communicator despite his vocal disability. The fact that he can still communicate well despite his disability, I think says a lot about him. So anyway, go back and listen to the space. It's good. A lot of great content in there. And with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.